Obviously, I congratulate Boris Johnson on his election as Tory party leader. Despite our differences, and we have many of them, I'll do everything I can to develop a way of working with him that is constructive and protects and respects Scotland's interests and views. But of course, I can't deny, it would be hypocritical to deny the fact that I have profound concerns about the prospect of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. You know, the vast majority of people in Scotland, had they been given any choice, which they weren't, wouldn't have chosen to hand the keys to number 10 to somebody with Boris Johnson's views and track record. So people in Scotland, I'm sure many people across the whole of the UK will be very concerned about the prospect of his premiership. He's got the opportunity now, of course, to prove people wrong. I'm not sure whether he will do so. The jury is certainly out, and that's probably as mildly as I can put it.
Right. I mean, there was a democratic process, and that process led to a leave decision, and Boris Johnson is simply planning to implement that decision.
Well, there was a democratic process in Scotland. The outcome of that democratic process was 62% of people voted against Brexit. A similar proportion voted for anti-Brexit parties in the recent European elections. My job as First Minister of Scotland is to represent those views and to do everything I can to avoid Scotland being taken out of the EU against our will, and in particular to block any attempt to take the UK out of the EU with no deal, because Boris Johnson, no matter how hard he might try, cannot maintain that he's got a mandate for a no-deal Brexit.
Well, I mean, he's got a mandate, certainly, from this morning's result. But if your MPs, and if you really wanted to, if your MPs really wanted to stop no deal, you could have got them to vote for Theresa May's deal.
Well, Theresa May's deal was a bad deal. It would have taken us out of the EU with no clarity about what came
better
next.
Than no deal, then.
The SNP are not going to vote for things. Well, you know, it's like the fire or the frying pan. Our job is not to just always look for the least worst option. I'm maybe old-fashioned in politics, but I still think the job of politicians should be to work for and campaign for and argue for the best for the people that they represent. And for Scotland, that is not leaving the EU at all. Now, you know, Boris Johnson has said that he's determined to leave on the 31st of October with no deal. Well, I'll put him on notice that me, my government, the SNP will do everything we can to block that, because it would be catastrophic for people's jobs and livelihoods and living standards. It would have, you know, a modern country like the UK talking about whether they could secure medicine supplies. It defies logic and common sense, and any political leader that sought to do that would have no regard at all for the basic well-being of the citizens, the length and breadth of the UK.
Isn't it in your interest in some way for Boris Johnson to pursue a no deal, because that, in your view, may bolster your argument for an independence referendum again?
Look, I don't want to see things happen that do real damage to the UK. I didn't want Brexit. I didn't want Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. So I take no pleasure in what's happening in the UK right now. But certainly it does make the case for Scotland having the ability to choose an alternative all the stronger. Because right now we are simply having to accept decisions that we don't want, that have profound consequences for our future, and that are against our will. If we're an independent country, we can choose our own future and build relationships, maintain and build relationships with others across the UK, Europe and further afield. That's a far better prospect for Scotland than a Boris Johnson premiership taking us out of the EU against our will.
OK, just two more quick ones. Is this, in your view, could this be how the United Kingdom ends?
I think Scotland will become an independent country. I think everything that has happened over the past 3 years, yes, I think Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister increases the probability of that.
You don't have the votes for it now, do you?
Scotland will become an independent country. Every poll since the last independence referendum shows rising support for independence. We had a poll a couple of weeks ago showing majority support in the scenario where Boris Johnson becomes Prime Minister. But ultimately, of course, it's a positive case. It's a case for Scotland being in charge of our own destiny, taking the decisions that are right for Scotland, having good constructive relationships with other parts of the British Isles, with Europe and others across the world.
Okay.
That's the positive case for independence, and I think Scotland will get there sooner rather than later.
All right, and just finally, when Boris Johnson, if he does make his tour of the UK, his tour of the Union, you'll meet him quite happily, will you?
Look, I'm the First Minister of Scotland. I've met and dealt with Boris Johnson's predecessors, Theresa May and David Cameron. Boris Johnson's the third Prime Minister in my tenure as First Minister. I will seek to have the same relationship with Boris Johnson. We'll meet him, talk to him. I will not disguise the many differences we have, but I'll make the case for the interests of the country I serve and represent as First Minister. And I will do that with Boris Johnson, as I have done with his predecessors. What I would say is I hope Boris Johnson shows more of a willingness to listen to Scotland and respect our views than his immediate predecessor has done.